there! Tonight we're going to talk about the tonal system in the Orthodox Church. You've probably heard people talking about singing in a certain tone and wondered, what does that mean? Well, after listening to this lesson, you will have some idea. So in the Orthodox Church, we use a system of 8 tones. And a tone is a collection of musical notes or melodies that are reused every time that tone is done. We'll get into more detail about how some of the tonal systems work later. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight. We're going to talk more about the big idea of the tones and what it means. So in the Orthodox Church, we have a rotating schedule of tones, 1 through 8. And last weekend, when I was singing Vespers and Liturgy, we were tone 8. This next week, we're going to be tone 1. The week after that, we're going to be tone 2, tone 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And all across the world, everybody's singing the same tone every week. Whether you're in Russia, Moldavia, Eritrea, or Milwaukee, you're going to be singing the same tone. That doesn't mean everyone sings the same music, and we will get on to that question in a little bit. But what is a tone, and where does this idea come from? Well, we can trace the history of the tonal system back to ancient Greece, and that's an entirely different and fascinating topic, which we're not going to cover in this talk tonight. But it is clear that our tonal system and different branches of it originate in ancient cultures, even pre-Christian cultures. However, for our practical purposes, probably the earliest Orthodox chant system that we can easily and readily identify is the Byzantine chant system that comes out of Byzantium, or modern-day Istanbul. So back in the day, this was part of what we would identify as Greece back then, and it's on the Mediterranean Sea, a really important culture that gave us a lot of substance when it comes to talking about the tonal systems. So one way that we can think about understanding the tonal system is by talking about Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant is a Western form of chant that is most associated with medieval times, so quite a bit later than the beginning of Byzantine chant. However, most Westerners have some idea of what Gregorian chant is. You've probably heard it in maybe a Catholic or Episcopalian or Anglican church, or a monastery group of monks or nuns that are singing Gregorian chant. It's this very pleasant, kind of free-flowing, peaceful-sounding music that was typically used in the early Catholic Church and kept even to modern days in some of their monasteries. And if you ever studied music in college and studied Gregorian chant, you would have learned that there are certain scales that are associated with each mode of Gregorian chant, and there are anywhere from 8 to 12 different modes, depending on what era of history you're talking about. So when you go to study Gregorian chant, you have to learn what is the scale for this mode. There's the Dorian mode and the Mixolydian mode and, a whole bunch of different ones. But when you think of our scale, our common Western scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, so, fa, re, mi, re, do. When you go to sing the Mixolydian or Phrygian or Dorian tones, you'll find that a couple of those notes are completely missing from that do, re, mi scale, or they might be sharped or flatted. So it ends up sounding a little odd, sometimes a little spooky, sometimes more happy and what you would expect. But the each mode has its own scale, and when you're going to write a piece of music within that mode, you only use the notes on that scale. You don't use other notes. So it's the same kind of idea with Orthodox chant. And each different mode or tone, we tend to use the word tone, although in Byzantine chant, a lot of times you'll still hear them being talked about as modes instead of tones. We have a scale or a group of notes, or sometimes musical phrases and rhythms even, that are associated with a particular tone. Now, you can ask, like my husband who's a poet asks, why the different tones? What defines the tones? What's the emotional content of these tones? Why did they develop? Why this group of notes instead of that group of notes? These are things are fascinating questions I don't have answers for, and unfortunately we can't plumb the depths of all those questions. But in what we have inherited, the tonal systems are quite a bit more simplified than perhaps what their original intention was. I think in Byzantine chant you can tell sometimes from the name that there was probably more associated with the development of these tones, hundreds and thousands of years ago, because one of the Byzantine tones is referred to as the grave tone, so probably a more somber, serious tone. There was some emotion behind it. In our common experience of the tones, I think we've kind of lost that part of it. However, we have this really wonderful system of melodies and scales that change every 8 weeks in the Orthodox Church, and you kind of get this sense of the change of the seasons as you go from week to week. It's a little bit different each week. So in our culture, we could ask where did our chant system come from? It would be hard to answer when you're talking about America, because America is a melting pot of cultures, and we have a melting pot of tonal systems in our country as well. We have a lot of different kinds of chant that can be found all within the same country. Over time, the chant systems have developed uniquely in each country that becomes Orthodox. So one way of thinking about it and kind of getting your mind around it is perhaps with a story. The story of Prince Vladimir. And most of you have probably heard this story before, but it's a great one for musicians. And the story goes that Prince Vladimir, around about the year 1000 or so, I think, sent a bunch of emissaries out to traverse the world and look into religion, because he just decided his people, his country, they needed more religion. And so he wanted to figure out which was the best religion. So people went to the east. They probably looked at Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism and who knows what, all these different religions. They came around to the city of Byzantium, and which is modern day Istanbul in Turkey. And at that time, the Byzantine Empire had a very rich liturgical tradition, very mature and well developed. And so when the emissaries came to Byzantium, they had this amazing experience. And when they went back to Prince Vladimir, they said, well, this religion had this good thing about it, this one we liked because of that, but when we went to Byzantium, we couldn't tell whether we were in heaven or on earth. It was that much of an incredible experience. And so, of course, as we know from history, Prince Vladimir decided to have everybody become Orthodox. And so you have these incredible icons of the baptism of Rus, where you'll see like 1,000 little tiny figures, people painted on this giant icon, rivers, mountains, streams, fields, everybody's getting baptized. It's quite an amazing story, very romantic, but nevertheless, it was that experience of worship, which for sure had music at its heart, that experience of the liturgical arts, the beauty of the church and everything that went into it, and then the music, kind of that organism that beats like a heart throughout worship, was so impactful for these people, that it was no contest in their minds of which religion they wanted to bring home. And so, gosh, I don't remember why I got off onto that. Oh, now I remember the story. Okay, so what was going on in Byzantium then? Byzantine chant. And I'm thinking, as I'm telling this story, it was probably earlier than the year 1000. I probably got the year wrong for Prince Vladimir, but you all can look it up, figure out what year we're talking about. I didn't do that level of study before starting this talk. Anyway, they heard beautiful Byzantine chant. Byzantine chant has an eson, or a drone, that is always going on underneath it, and then this very pretty flowery line up above that is built to hold the words of the hymn. And this is a principle that you're going to hear me talk about multiple times throughout these talks. Orthodox music is built for the hymnography, not the other way around. We don't write our hymns to fit our music. We write our music to hold and present our hymns. The text that we are singing is more important than the music. Okay? That's a good nugget, and we'll come back to it again and again. But it's something I want you to hang on to. So, we have this drone, this ison, I-S-O-N is the Greek term for it. You've got this ison, and then you have this really flowery, beautiful melody above that's holding your hymnography. So when Russia decides to become Orthodox, what do? They import all the artisans from the Orthodox Church, from Byzantium. So the priests, they have some priests go to Russia and teach them how to educate their priests, what their priests do, how they live. They brought up people that knew how to make prosperage, show them how to bake bread. How do you sew the vestments? I'm sure they've sent up seamstresses and all sorts of different artisans, not the least of which was their musicians. So the Russians started by learning Byzantine chant as best they could. This probably very foreign sounding music to their ears. They took it in, and they probably started with that. But when the Byzantine singers went back home, the Russians were left moving forward within their own culture, within their own experience of what sounds they were used to. And so their chant system changed and morphed over time. The earliest chant system that we know of in Russia is called Znameny chant. And Znamen, it means it's the little mark that they make on the music sheet. And it's similar to what the Byzantine music looked like, which had what we call neumes, these little marks on paper that would show what the melody is or what the note is. And Gregorian chant also, you can see, has the little squares. They're a little different than Western music on a staff that we're used to seeing with a bass and treble clef. So this earliest form of Russian music called Znameny within the Orthodox Church, called Znameny chant, was probably very much like Gregorian chant, or sounded similar to Gregorian chant. It has kind of a free-flowing melodic line, not quite as fancy as the Byzantine music got in a very, advanced culture of Byzantine Orthodox music. And which became more ornate over time. But the earliest Russian was pretty simple, not singing super high and super low, just kind of a medium range that most regular people could sing without having fancy training. And then over time, probably they added a drone or an eson to go along with it too. It's a little unclear how much or whether or not they used an eson. You can still hear ancient Znameni chant done in its fullness if you go to an Old Believers church, or you look up an Old Believers, a clip of that kind of chant. You can also hear Znameni chant in modern days coming out of Valam Monastery in Finland. They have returned to that kind of chant in recent decades. And over time, though, in Russia, Tsar Peter, opened up kind of the doorways to the West, and that had a huge influence on the music of Russia, whereas before they had more simple chant systems that would have been more similar to Byzantine chant. Over the years, when they started borrowing and exchanging a lot of things from Western culture, the concept of the tempered the piano came over, and the do re mi fa sol la ti do scale would have been introduced, and harmony and 4-part harmony, and finally chordal progression, where you're not even as interested in the melody anymore, but you're interested in what happens when these collection of notes all kind of go back and forth in different interesting ways, and building up to a big climax and then coming down to a resolution, which is something we're very used to hearing with Western ears. If you listen to any Western classical music, until you get into the later forms after the Romantic era, where you start having chaos introduced rhythmically or notation-wise. If you listen to Baroque music or classical music of that era, you have these nice progressions of chords. That starts being an important part of Russian liturgical music. But it's relatively late development. So that gives you an idea of how chant develops. And in the Russian Orthodox Church, you have Znameni chant, the early one that I told you about, that isn't used that much anymore, to be honest with you. You have Kievan chant, which is a very easy, melodic, friendly to Western ears sounding chant system that is used a lot in this country. And then you have the later development of what is often called obicode or court chant, that really is more focused on chordal progression and less on melody. So you can see how the tonal system changes over time and develops. And it also moves from one culture and country to another culture and country, which takes on its own properties. It lends its own properties to it, brings its own properties to the tonal system. So all of these systems, Byzantine chant, Znameni, Kievan, and obicode, they all have 8 tones, but the tones sound different. Okay, so Byzantine chant, tone 1, Lord, I have cried unto thee, hearken unto me. Kievan chant, tone 1, Lord, I have cried unto thee, hearken unto me. Hearken unto me, O Lord. Sorry, I don't have any of the others memorized, but that gives you an idea. They both have a full tonal system of 8 tones, but they sound pretty different. But every 8 weeks, that same melody for Lord, I have cried is going to happen in that church doing the Byzantine chant. And in the church doing the Kievan chant, that melody is going to be used every 8 weeks. So that's kind of gives you a basic understanding of what the tonal system is. And as I was mentioning, America is really a melting pot. We have all these different cultures and all of these different tonal systems that we can take advantage of here. So you can go to a Greek church and you can find them singing Byzantine chant, probably within a couple hours drive of where you are. You can also find a church that may be doing Romanian chant. You can find one that is doing Obikode, Russian court chant. You can probably find one that's doing Kievan chant, where I go. That's what we do, Kievan chant. So you can find all different chant systems, and you can find churches that are doing one cohesive chant system. You can also find a lot of churches, mine included, this is my personal preference, and it reflects all the different parishes that I've been in. You can find a lot of churches that are a microcosm of that melting pot, where we will use some Kievan chant, some Obikode chant, some Byzantine chant, some Gregorian chant, whatever catches my fancy, or whatever someone in the parish comes to me and says, I love this piece, could you please do it? It reminds me of my grandmother, or where I came from. And it could be an entirely different chant system that I've never explored before. So you can have both experiences in this country. And the question of our own American tonal system, well, I'll tell you that there are choir directors and singers and chanters that talk about this. Probably no one else does, but it's something that we see, as our birthright on the horizon. It will happen. Probably not in our lifetime, but it will happen eventually, because it's happened over and over again throughout history, that each culture takes the idea of an Orthodox tonal system and makes it their own, that's reflective of their own culture. And we will eventually have one. Hopefully it won't sound like a Disney movie. But anyway, that's our American cultural heritage. We can go deeper than Disney, can't we? Yeah, we can. Anyway, so hopefully that answers some questions about what the tonal system is, and we will get into the specific chant system of Kievan chant and kind of the mechanics of it and how to do it and how it works. And there will also be another talk coming on a little bit more about the hymnography of the church and how services are put together. And it's going to have to be a number of different of these little messages. But hopefully you enjoyed this topic, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.